Hello, and we are live, and you are very welcome to today's session. I am your host, as ever, Ger Adlum from Payslip, and today I'm joined by the fountain of payroll knowledge, that is Mary Holland, hugely experienced global payroll practitioner, and now a global payroll advisor, assisting payroll teams with all manner of projects, including, and by no means limited to, managing a change in vendor. Hi, Mary. Very nice to have you with us.
Good afternoon, or I guess good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. For me, it's just morning. I'm here in sunny California, but Gerald just shared with me it's a little rainy in Dublin this morning.
It is. I'm dialing in from Dublin, Ireland. In case you couldn't tell either by my accent, I've also worn a green shirt just to really make sure you know where I'm dialing in from. But that's a nice point, Mary. I'd actually love to know those joining us on today's session. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. We always get such a wide global mix, but yeah, we'd love to hear from you in the chat. Just pop in where it is you're dialing in from. Always nice to get a sense of how the spread is. Erin is dialing in from Canada. Neve from good old Wicklow in Ireland, the Garden County. Pamela from Limerick in Ireland. Brazil,
Brazil.
New Jersey. Fantastic. I mean, in true keeping with the theme of the webinar, it's global, which is always nice. Hi, Lane. Hi, Alison. Lovely. Las Vegas, Nevada. Beautiful. Uh, Shivangi says Guinness, Dublin capital. I love it. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Charlotte, North Carolina, Costa Rica, Fergus from Kildare, Spokane. Fantastic. Yeah, a legendary part of the US. As an Irish person, you often hear about places in America only in passing or in popular media. I feel like I've heard about Spokane in a country and western song, maybe. Maybe that's why it's in my mind. But yeah, but wherever you're from, Spain to Costa Rica to Charlotte, North Carolina, and everywhere in between, you're all very welcome to today's session. Mary, more than any other topic that we have created a webinar on this year. This is a topic that when we sent the invitations out, overwhelmingly we got responses saying, yes, please, I need to attend a session on this topic. Why do you think that might be? What is it about changing payroll vendors that I guess, gets people a little nervous, a little stressed?
Well, I think it's the reality as you in your organization, especially where your footprint is, what you're doing if you're expanding or you're working with your current vendors. There's always pressure from the leadership to kind of consolidate, better reporting, and all of those things come in place. And then it just really comes back to looking
Hmm.
at your personal situation for your company. Are you receiving the services that you actually need? And what is that? Relationship is a big piece. So I think that's one of the big pieces of what happens with it. And then how hard is it, right? How hard is it to make that change? And who do I pick, right? It's like, how do you go shopping and pick that vendor that's going to meet your needs? Because I always tell people to kind of think about that because the grass isn't always greener on the other side. You may be facing new challenges with that new vendor or provider. What does that look like? And it does involve, I would say, thinking about it, right? And I think that's why it
Hmm.
becomes was very popular. The other thing is it's something that's happening today, every single day, is people are having to make a change. They're having to look at what's best for their organization on the global payroll roadmap.
Yeah. Well, I just shared a poll, just curious to know for those joining in what their vendor change plans were. Yeah, some of you sort of have no current plans, but you never know when it will pop its head up. Sometimes there's a dip in service or business circumstances change. But overwhelmingly, it's planning a vendor change over the next 2 years. So this year and next year. So look, hopefully there's some food for thought and some frameworks in place to kind of help you prepare for that change. So, Mary, looking then today at our agenda, we've sort of broken it down into four sections. Look, we could have run sessions on this. We probably could have ran for 4 hours on this. There's so much to
Yeah.
cover. But I guess when we looked at it, we thought there's kind of four main areas. One is objective setting and getting the internal alignment right. So you know what you're getting into. All the stakeholders are sort of lined up and we're all on the same page. the actual selection process itself. And Mary, you've put together some fabulous material for people to take away after this webinar in terms of, I suppose, how to create a framework, right? What is your selection criteria when you enter into that evaluation process? And what are some of the questions that you need to be asking nice and early when you go through that evaluation? Then we're going to look at some of the migration pitfalls. In other words, why changes succeed or fail. And Mary will be sharing a few lessons learned from the trenches along the way. And indeed, as we go through, you know, I don't say this sort of, you know, without good reason. I want to hear from people in the audience as well, their own lessons learned, what they've been through, the sort of the takeaways that they've learned along the way. All really valuable stuff for everyone joining in. And then lastly, ensuring that seamless transition. And Mary's going to do a little bit around sort of parallel testing and integration plan that you ought to have in place for making sure that things go right, the other side of it. So Mary, I guess the first question that comes to mind is, why do companies switch vendors at all? And, I guess in a funny kind of way, there's a compatriot slide to this, which is what are all the reasons why you would not want to change vendors? And so I think a lot of it comes down to fear of change, the risk of something going wrong. But for you, what if sort of, and again, in your advisory capacity, but also in your own lived experience of payroll, what have been those primary motivating factors for a change in vendors? Sometimes it feels like enough is enough. We got to get rid of these guys and go to someone else.
In one case, and when I was in working with a team in EMEA when I was a global payroll owner, one of the reasons why we were making a switch was to consolidate the vendors in Europe because we didn't have a lot of resources, right, in Europe. And we didn't really have, the company would rather have us look for vendors and pay more for the services that we had instead of keeping to hire a lot of people. So we looked at the landscape, we looked at we needed some better services, we needed some better vendors, and that was one of the reasons for consolidation. What I'm also seeing, in the industry today is because of the procurement pieces and the SLAs and all of the pieces, I would say all the administrative pieces of working with vendors require a lot of work. And when I say even a lot of work, it's looking at the contracts, making sure that things are in place, that you're looking at the financial pieces of who you're working with, but also the big kind of one is data privacy, right? Because we know in the global payroll space, that is the number one thing that we have to make sure that we're following that to a T and we're looking at it and watching it. So I think those are some of the reasons as we look through it. But when we look through, a lot of people are acquiring companies, some are downsizing. So really, sometimes it depends on what's happened in your organization. You may have a vendor that worked well for you when you had 100 people, but now you've scaled up to 5,000. And that is not the sweet spot or the best place for that particular vendor that you have. You need to get a larger, more robust vendor for those situations. And often, one size doesn't always fit all as we look at vendors. So that's another thing. People are sometimes looking at that. But as you know, in the global payroll space, it's really what the business needs are, the language pressures that we need. We have somebody from Brazil here. We definitely need some Portuguese support when we're working. We need the
Right.
English and the Portuguese when we're choosing that vendor in that particular region, along with the complexity of what happens in Brazil. So looking at that piece. And then in today's world, our leaders are looking right for integration, reduced manual work, efficiency, global reporting. All of those are items that are out there. Are we filling out a bunch of templates, right? How productive is that in the day job? So those are all things that kind of get pulled
Mhm.
into, do we need to make a change now? Some of you just said you don't need to make a change, but there are things to think about. And keep those things as your company goes through processes or changes, or you're being asked. You already
Yeah.
have done your due diligence to know why we don't need to change vendors. And here's the value of each vendor, right? Because you can be asked by leadership, why do you have this? Why do you have 10 vendors versus can we scale down to 5? So thinking about that.
Yeah.
So, as you in the introduction, one of the things that I wanted to kind of share with you is there's a lot of material on the slides, and maybe it's
Yeah.
part of being around payroll professionals. They like material to have as reference points. So I would encourage you, as I always encourage any session or training I have, is use the material for you and your team to review. And then also in the future, you can have that as a reference material, kind of thinking about after today's session, where do we want to go? We're not going to make a change this year, but I might be looking at it in 2026 in March.
Yeah, exactly. And just to say, we will, of course, share both the recording, but also the deck and the material. And we've added a few bits to the appendix at the end as well. But as we go through it, you'll see we've got lists of questions and sort of a framework. So don't worry if we fly through it or we don't cover every single sentence on the slide. You will have all of that afterwards, as Mary says, to dissect with your team. So looking then, Mary, at this topic, which is, I guess, defining your goals. And Danielle, thank you so much for sharing it in the chat that one of your aspirations with your change in vendors is to automate time and attendance and HR systems and reduce the number of systems that you're using. And I guess for me, Mary, that underlines, I think, something that's really important to consider, which is if you can frame this not as a risk and as a very scary change that we're going through, but actually a window of opportunity to make a positive change, not just in terms of service, but in terms of systems, in terms of our technology, in terms of our future planning. I guess it's a different mindset when it comes to actually defining what your objectives are.
Right, and so Daniela's example is perfect because right, she's thought about what she needs. Time and attendance, everyone on this call can relate how complex it is and what they're trying to achieve. But when she's asking for funding and to make a change and supporting presenting something to leadership and to the stakeholders, she has a clear path of what she's doing and has the where the direction is and the reasons that they need that, right? So it's when you actually have your direction, what you're trying to align to, and it's I hate to say having some documentation around it, right? The documentation, the benefits, right? The pieces that are happening. And sometimes if you're having so many problems with a vendor and you're not sure what to do and how you're going to document, often I would tell people just to use the SWOT analysis. That's looking at the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats with that vendor. And when you map that out just kind of on a template, it's easy to talk to people and also identify immediately where we have to make decisions on things, like looking at the steps. The reasons what we want goals set is what's the direction we're going to be in our path and our roadmap and what we're trying to achieve. And of course, on the slide we always know the employee experience is absolute key. We hear about that in every aspect, not just in payroll, it's in the HR, it's in recruiting, it's in all areas. So it's something that employees are expecting. And so if your vendor isn't providing some of the services that are available today, if we think about having your payslip being delivered to your HCM system, be it Workday, be it Success Factors, so you have a single experience, that is something that they're expecting. And why are they expecting it? They're talking to their friends and whatever, and their friends have that at their companies, right? So it's they're expecting those services. So those are things that happen. But I think the big one is really making sure that you have global coverage and looking at the integrations and reducing the manual work that is involved. So what does that mean for your particular organization when you're looking at those goals? What are you trying to achieve? And what's broken today? Really kind of, you're not going to have everything, right? So thinking about that, life isn't always perfect. We want it to be perfect, but we have to think about what we really need today and what we can afford. So once again, I have to throw in the what we can afford in our organization because sometimes our organizations don't have as much money to spend on some of the cost related to this, but we need to take a look at what we can get for the value that we have and communicate that. But we definitely, if you don't have a goal and a starting point, you don't even have the roadmap to start with your team, with your stakeholders, with the leadership. and what are you trying to achieve. You see it, you see the path to the end, right, if you have your goal. And I really like the fact that about her sharing about the time and attendance, because all of us can relate to how complex that is and what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think ultimately, I suppose a clear definition of your goal at the outset is what is going to keep you focused when it comes to that vendor evaluation, because it can be very easy to get distracted maybe by some of the bells and whistles that are on offer from a particular vendor, and suddenly you lose sight of it. You think, okay, well, you know what, maybe they don't quite tick the main box, but look at all the additional stuff we're getting with it. And short term, that might seem good, but then the old problem you had reemerges, and you think, why did we go through all of that pain and that change, and we haven't addressed actually the main thing we wanted to address in the first place? And
Yeah,
so so again, it seems like a simple step, but I think it's one that gets overlooked. But one thing, Mary, then I suppose moving on, I guess, to the meat and drink of this, aligning this for me, I think would be one of the most difficult parts of the whole process, because you're often dealing with departments, albeit internal, but they're departments that don't necessarily understand the pain. They don't feel it in the same way that you do, right? They're not at the sharp end of the challenges that you're having with a particular vendor. The likelihood is all of these stakeholders, they'd all much prefer that you didn't change anything, because nothing is broken necessarily from their point. So I guess my question, Mary, is how do you go about getting everyone on the same page? How do you go about expressing the challenge that you're trying to solve, buy-in and tacit support?
So first of all, for everybody on the call, we're talking about vendors, but I really, really encourage people to have strong stakeholder relationships with those groups that you're working with every day. And that is, we look at
Mm,
HR, comp, if you have equity, the stock group, all of those groups benefits is once you start to have those relationships, then you can start to talk about the things that you're having challenges with. They're having challenges too on their side, right? So you may have to support that. So making sure that you're sharing the reasons why you need to have this happen and what at the end, remember, some of these groups are the main focus is on the employee. What is the employee experience going to be, and what does that look like? Or it's like, what amount of work am I going to have to do for this, right? What is it? What are you going to ask me to do in this project? What does it look like in that process? And our friends in finance are going to be concerned with making sure that the delivery of that financial information that they're receiving today is going to be received in the format that they need, and it's going to be timely, right? And I totally get, having worked in finance for many years, I get that. And it's important because
mm,
that's what their role is. So making sure that you're sharing, explaining the buy-in, and bring it in as early as possible so you're just not throwing something in there, and you need their backup, right? So when we're looking at the next thing that we have on the screen is getting executive sponsorship. Well, we need to have support from our senior management that we report into and why we're doing this, and they need to be able to share and may have to bring it up to different levels in the organization that they're reporting to, because what's on the roadmap for the year for spending, for using IT support, for making changes in the organization. Having worked for a very large public traded company, we couldn't make any changes to any vendors the last quarter of the year. And the reason behind that, someone would say, well, what if it's small or it's not a big impact? The reason was they wanted to make sure that the IT support was available and being used for the financial reporting for year end. They didn't want to have any changes. We didn't want to have any risks or red flags that would bring in more audit things that were going to happen. So with that, you understand what that is. The sponsorship is there. Your sponsor is there and is key, because when things don't go well, they're kind of your backup. And I'll definitely say, in one organization I was doing consulting with, the executive leadership that was sponsoring the project, and it was a global payroll project. The vendor that they had chosen, and I was not involved in the selection of the vendor. I also understand the reason they had to pick that vendor was for many, many reasons. They were a government company. They had to look at the financials of all the vendors and many, many pieces. Also the government group or government contractors, the groups in the organization got to pick kind of who they wanted and what they selected. Not probably the perfect vendor, but the challenge was we had to make it work, right? So I came in the middle of the project, right? So we had the first thing was a relationship with the vendor that they chose, right? So fixing that relationship. And in some cases, I ended up telling the senior leaders that these are some of the things that are happening. This is the support we need from you, and this is the support we need from the vendor. And the salesperson that had sold the product to this particular organization had also stayed involved with the organization. So he was very supportive. We end up starting to have leadership calls with them, and once a month, I mean, once a week, to overtake some of the things that were needed. But at the end, it really opened up the door with being able to communicate what the problem was and what's on the roadmap. So really, I would say in that example, that leadership was something that really I appreciated the leader that being on the calls with us and supporting the teams and knowing what the roadmap was. And she also was well aware of the decision because it was evaluated ahead of time in the pros and cons, but she also knew why they had to do that. So that kind of an example of a great using that so that everybody knows where you can go for help and assistance. And that kind of communication between the vendor and you is key. And of course, if we look at ownership, everybody has to know what responsibilities they have. And that's really just defining things. And I think that's extremely important if you're going to make a vendor change. What do you want a group from HR to do? Do you want them to sit and review different vendors? What do you want them to look and what the role and responsibilities you want them to play in? Do you want them to be a voting group that's going to vote on the vendor selection? What is the role that you want them to play? And then making sure as we align all the pieces that we're pulling everybody in. And when we talk about all those stakeholders, we talk about sometimes there's a few, recently there's a few kind of pieces where people have told me what's happened and they didn't pull in finance in their project, right? And so finance didn't have the general ledger file in the format they needed. They weren't even on board with what the change was. So it was a huge impact for them. And as I already shared with you is, we in finance have no time when we're doing reporting for anything that's not on schedule and plan and what we have. And if you've never been in that role, you don't understand that. But knowing that is an important key person to talk to and ask. So making sure that you're aligning them all together with the change that you have. So there's no surprises, right? Definitely, I think there's no surprises and use their support. So finance people are great to pull into a vendor change and putting them in the implementation, have them look at your GL file if you're asking for a GL file. They'll give you the information. They'll walk through all the pieces that everybody doesn't really know the ins and outs of, and they'll get the file in the format and off you go, right? So those are things to think about how we're going to use the stakeholders to benefit us as we move forward.
I think as well a big part of this is giving people a little sense of ownership about the
Mm-hmm.
project as well, and a little bit of pride in the project too. And even down to things like, let's say things start to run over and there maybe you need a month's extension with your current vendor, someone's got to pay for that. If you've already involved your finance team in the planning of the whole way along, there's less of a sting. They already understand why perhaps it's being delayed. You're not sort of having to battle with a lot of information. When you come to them with the request, they already understand the context. That's massive.
I think that's absolutely massive. And, knowing like knowing when that contract's going to expire is going to be key. And the procurement and the finance team need to know that. But if you're doing if you're doing acquisitions, there was one situation that I was involved in. We're doing an acquisition, and they said they had no payroll contract. It was month to month, and they wanted to move everybody from that one group onto the existing vendor that they had sitting for the London payroll. And as it turns out, when we were talking to the vendor they were using and getting some information and walking through the plan, the vendor then told the team, you have a 2-year contract that was just signed. But nobody knew in procurement. And the finance team wasn't aware because they went through this acquisition so fast and everybody said no to everything. And so when you ask the question, can we make a change? The answer was yes, we're month to month, right? And so lessons learned is that's why you use procurement and some of the legal people to help you to make sure where can we make that change and what does that look like for the organization. So that in that particular organization, they paid twice for a period of time because it was a goal that they wanted. But remember, the goal can cost, but it was something that they wanted. And it was lessons learned, I think, for future acquisitions that they had it on their kind of checklist.
Well, I'm glad you sort of broached the idea of when procurement can be your best friend in this situation, because I think that also teases up nicely for the next part of this, which is your vendor evaluation framework. And the reason I think it's really important to have a set criteria and a structure that you can approach each of those evaluations, as you come to those conversations with vendors, that there's a consistent level of scoring, is also so that you have something to fight back against procurement, Mary, when they inevitably say, I want to go with this vendor because it's the cheapest. And I don't say that disparagingly, but that is,
No.
let's be honest, that is the reality sometimes with procurement team. They often their KPIs or how much are based on how much money have you saved us vis-a-vis versus last year's contract. But I think, why I love this, and I'll let you talk us through the framework, Mary, is it gives you a structure, it gives you a scoring criteria to be able to stand behind it and go, actually, we want to go with this vendor, and here's why. They score much better in these core areas, and it's consistent and it's documented and it's there to refer to.
No, I think that's an excellent point because if you don't have a scoring matrix, right, and you're scoring it and the team is scoring it, you determine the team. It's hard when, as Gerald mentioned, if somebody says this is the lower cost, why aren't you going with the lower cost? So you have to be able to understand where the risks are, right, and what we're getting. So really by doing the due diligence and the framework of working with the vendor and having the template to evaluate the person, then you have the vendor, you have the ability to know what you can compare one, this vendor A to vendor B to vendor C, and then it also helps you identify what you're losing in vendor. If you pick vendor C, what are you losing if you pick vendor C, right? What's actually happening. And when we talk about cost, that plays a piece in it. So we may have to say, if we go with vendor C, because this is where the cost piece is, what are we losing? Are we losing integration? We have more manual work. The other pieces of, what is a reputation of costs and additional charges, and what does that look like? So looking at what that looks like is important. So we know in today's world, our technology and integration are key. Like what do we have and what integration ability do they have, and is it seamless, and what does that look like? And so when I say that, this is a deep dive into asking the vendor the proof of showing you what happens and looks like, and then having that reference point of how many Workday integrations have they done? How many, Oracle integrations have they done? Time and attendance, can they bring that information in? What does that look like to you, and how what that looks like? And the cost, right? The cost of those integrations or the build on the integrations, what does that look like a long term, or I have to make changes? So making sure that you're looking at that, talking to references, getting, the vendor will always give you references, right? And having been given references in the past, I was always honest, the pros and cons of it. And I always let the person that was asking me questions know that this went wrong, but here's what happened with the vendor. The vendor made these corrections. So we had good communication on this, or this didn't work, or these were things I had to escalate, right? So making sure that if you are doing references and you're talking to people, be honest about it. And then also remember, like I said, grass isn't always greener. The vendor, no perfect vendor in the world. We're all going to have some challenges that aren't going to work, and we have to make sure we look at that. But the references, I definitely talk to payroll professionals. There's a lot of information out there. I'm making sure when you're talking to them, you kind of explain what you're trying to achieve, right? Because what they have may be slightly different than what you want to do, right? So you kind of have to think about it as big picture. Look and talk to people that have, I also encourage people to go to payroll events, right? Wherever you are in the world, there's events. Going to those events, talking to the professionals that are there, and then also talking to the vendors that are there, even if you're not, some of you aren't looking this year to make a change, or may not even in 2026, but doing your homework to know what that looks like. So getting that piece. And then as we think globally, we're global. Okay. We have to, the world has really changed from a point where everybody was at one point just doing the country. Germany was doing their payroll with a local provider, and you might have had Belgium, you might have had China. They're all doing them kind of individually, no linking to integration, no linking to global reporting. You really didn't have visibility, as I would say, to what is happening today. And I think they were just kind of what organizations were just letting them operate. And it was going through that process, and they didn't have any impact until the reality started to hit with the growth of what happened if we look at our friends in finance, the cost, the number of operations we had outside a certain area. If our headquarters, for example, was in the US, many of the operations and things were being done outside the US, and the costs were there. So people were starting to look at the risk. The data privacy became a very, very key thing as we go into our journey. We started to look at what leaders want. They want to be able to have the visibility, to be able to be scalable, understand where they should be spending their money. So all of those are things that we have to look at. The global piece, we've kind of talked about the risk. Looking at the data privacy piece is key. I'm really strong on making sure that people spend time on that one. And then the vendor's financial situation. Your organization and procurement, and depending on what your organization will have certain criteria for the vendor's financial status, right? So we know that's reasonable in large organizations, what they have to look for, and we have to understand that that's what we have to do there. And then for me, support is always key. I do want to have the support when I need it. I want that someone to understand that I have a problem and how you're going to escalate it through the process, and then you're measuring those things, and who can you call and who will help you with that particular problem. And those vendor pieces are part of that. I would say the vendor piece, when you're making that selection, all of this is part of it, but the big piece is really kind of a little bit like that dating game. Am I going to be able to work with that person through the process? Can I call that person and say, look, we have a problem? And that person will then go through the escalation. So that to me is key. And you never know, you may never need to have that, but if you do, most of us that have been in those situations know if you had somebody to talk to and they went through the process with you and they made sure we kind of evaluated and did the root cause reason of what happened with it is key. And then you feel better and more confident in the trust in the relationship. So that's kind of, and all of
Yeah,
these are part of your scoring card. And those are questions. As you meet and talk to these people, you have to ask questions. That's why procurement's good at those. And then it kind of
absolutely.
goes, go ahead, as we
No, I
move
was
over.
gonna, I was gonna say, Mary, that like in terms of you've also got a nice kind of selection of potential questions that you could just to get people thinking about questions. But I suppose I wanted to make the point, the reason why it's so beneficial to have your consistent set of questions going into those sales pitches, right? And let's be honest, that's what they are when you're sitting down
Mhm.
for those first couple of calls with a payroll provider, they're pitching to you. And I think what I see happen so often is that people get a little bit bamboozled and that they let that vendor or that salesperson drive the conversation. And yes, it's important that they, give you their pitch and they express what they can do for you. But it's just as important that you take control of the conversation so that you come away from it going, okay, I was able to ask my questions, I was able to get the information that I need. And, a bit like speed dating, Mary, to go, you're harping on the dating reference.
Yeah.
You want to make sure that you're asking the questions about things that are important to you, because otherwise you can very easily get sidetracked and the conversation becomes about what the vendor's good at, not what you actually need them to do.
Yeah, that's an excellent point because it all looks shiny and bright and great, right? And another kind of I got you that at one point in my career we were looking for a vendor and we chose the vendor, but the demo that they were using was in a product release that was coming in 3 months. So, I mean, it's kind of that I got you
Mm.
question. So it's always been, I got you. Is this the current product that's out there today? So if, is this what XYZ company is using today to process the payroll? So it's really looking at those pieces. So kind of breaking it down to questions to ask. There's a lot of questions to ask, but this is why a group of people thinking about it and your goals and what you're trying to achieve is, the experience, how long they've been in businesses, the type of services, the compliance. Now, we know in global payroll and payroll compliance is always going to be key. And what does that look like? So, and then we go
Yeah.
into the financials, and then really what features we want, the benefits. Do you need something from benefits, reports, and all of those pieces are all things we need to know. And talking about what contract looks like, and that's why procurement will be there to help us with that contract.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're really making allegiances and building bridges with procurement people, I think, on this call today, Mary. I think as well, it's also quite important to not make certain assumptions about what a vendor does or not, does not do. Particularly, you might be coming from a vendor. Well, vendor A had XY features, functionalities, integrations in place. You can very easily assume that every vendor has that, or just more specifically, that the vendor we're talking to, that we're in agreement with, that they already have that. Don't assume anything. If you need a specific thing, you have got to ask for it because it's too late when you sort of get to the testing stage and then you're going, okay, great, where's the integration? And they go, oh yeah, we don't do that. Or we don't do it in the way that you thought we did it. You thought we automated it. Actually, it's still manual hand cranking. That all the time.
Well, it's even worse. Well, you didn't ask for it. We didn't, there's no integration. We'll give it to you, but here's an additional
You got to
cost,
pay for it.
right?
Yeah.
The fees and breaking down that and that's why, as you mentioned, Gerald, having our friends in procurement helping us with that. So looking at, the change, the right way, the wrong way, looking at having good data, clear communications, we talked about that, the timing, doing that due diligence on the vendors. The wrong way is really skipping testing, not doing that due diligence, having bad data. So bad data kind of starts the program off, and not having, the communication is key in both pieces. So everybody understands the goal. The goal would be the right way too, to make a clear goal, and we're measuring that we're achieving our goal.
Yeah. You've sort of put together, and look, we don't need to go through all of them. I guess maybe one or two, Mary, the ones that stand out for you in terms of some of the hard lessons that you've learned along the way. And again, I'd love to throw this out to all of the people who are joining us. What are one or two of the lessons that you've learned the hard way from vendor transitions? Those things that if you could go back in time and say to your former self, you got to watch out for this, what would it be?
Um, all of these play a key part. One things, depending on where you are in your journey, if this is your first vendor change or you've done 10 before, I can tell you my very first vendor change, the salespeople said they could do it in X amount of time, and the company was looking to do it to save money to move from one service to the other. Was a cost piece, and we had acquired a company and they had used them. So we got really good things, but they weren't ready for our timepiece. So that really raised the flag to me that yes, you told me we're ready, but I had to go back and use the other vendor for a month. Um, that was another piece that in that lessons learned, I had good leadership support. So the VP that I was working with, was aware of the situation of what was happening, kept him informed, and then we were able to work through that. That's why there's many pieces. All of these play a piece of what's happening, and a lot of time it's the data that's so bad. So bad data, we start to unravel it. That becomes a mess. We can't even do anything with it. And what does that look like? And
Yeah.
so it's it's kind of really on the slide talking about, what's the situation today and do you feel comfortable with it? What does that look like? Have you, making sure that when you're doing the testing that you trust the results that are happening, the timing's going to be critical, and making sure you allow for safety nets, right? So really having in the in any of these vendor pieces as a best practice, what's your backup plan? What is going to be my backup plan? I always have a backup plan in the back of my mind when I've been on projects is what am I going to do if something doesn't work? Like, what do I have the ability to go to use the current vendor, or what's going to happen if I go with this vendor? What is going to happen, and what's the risk? Can they do the calculations and you get employees paid, but what's the risk, for some of the compliance things that you might have to do some work on, or get some support on? And that goes back to the data. The data kind of can be, you may have to go out to in a CPA or accounting firm to look at what's going on and what you've reported.
Yeah, and as we've sort of titled it here, um, data readiness, that sort of so often is the determining factor as to whether or not something is going to be successful. And you use that phrase, garbage in, garbage out.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's look, we don't need to go through all of it, and I'm conscious of time. Again, people can take this away with them and dissect, in their own time. But I think a crucial one here is documenting what some of the manual patches that are actually going on in our payroll processes right now. Because again, let's be honest, we're all human. We know sometimes in our payroll operations, there are things which we know technically, the process isn't right, but we fix it. Eventually, we
Right.
fix it before that data goes live or before it's acted upon. But also, that vendor, they also may be doing things on your behalf that you don't necessarily see. So I guess, Mary, you've made that point to me that it's about document actually what's going on at a manual level so that you can, at the very least, hand that blueprint over to your new vendor. Best case scenario, you actually see that, during the migration as well. You say, actually, we normally do it this way. Ideally, we'd like to change how we do it. But again, it's something to factor in, Mary.
Yeah, it's definitely something to factor in and look at it, and realize when you're in that situation, something comes up. You're not the first person that this has happened to. So just remember, it's working through the issues and looking at the data. The data has to be clean for you to feel comfortable with what's happening. Gerald's right. There's a lot of these kind of fixes in the background we may not be aware of, and our teams may be doing things that we never know until we start to do that deep dive into doing the moving from vendor A to vendor B.
Yeah. Um, and then, yeah, I guess, look, what's the upshot of all of this is when you have those errors on day one, you've lost that trust immediately. I suppose it goes back to the idea of running those parallel tests. You kind of said to me before, Mary, we discussed at a minimum you would want two parallel tests.
Yeah, I mean, depending on the size, I'd love to have two. If it's smaller, one would be good. And then, of course, the cost is something. So two parallels, timing is all the pieces. So sometimes it goes back to one, but know what the problems are in that first parallel. And so
Hmm.
you have it documented so that you can be successful. And kind of as the kind of endpoint is, if the employee doesn't receive their pay on time, and it's not compliant, that brings a huge uproar into any organization, and payroll loses trust, right? So in a given second, it may be a small item, but employees talk to each other, and then it snowballs into a larger item. And trust is something that employees have to be able to trust that the teams that are doing the processing are going to deliver. So that is the biggest piece of any change, is to think about what that looks like. And it's would not be a pretty sight if people weren't paid on time, and it would be not a pretty situation when there's compliance issues, because then the company's at risk for different things too, depending on what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the parallel testing, it's also an area where it's sort of ripe for misalignment with that new vendor
Hmm.
because your expectations around what they will be able to do in the build up to that switchover might be wildly different from what they do. As in, you could come to them close to the time and go, okay, great, we're looking at two tests, and they sort of turn around and go, actually, look at the SLA we've agreed to. We only do one, or we just do a partial run. We don't do a full run with all data. Or they might even say, actually, we don't do test runs. That's not part of our process.
And those are all items that you need to talk about during the contract, so that you're well aware of what that is, because there's huge exposure. And like, I'll go back to what's actually happening: number of employees, numbers of integrations, all of the complexity of that's happening. A lot of organizations and a lot of professionals that are on this call have large organizations, and there's a lot of, I would say, integrations from many systems that are brought into when you're making a change. You got to make sure the parallels are working, the integrations are working, because at the end of the day, your only other choice is to revert back to the current, to what you're doing today. But what can you do that? We don't know if you can or cannot do that. That talks about another whole situation of letting the previous vendor know that you're leaving. And then what is that cost, or the timing? The timing is a situation. Once I was helping a company, they had, they did the parallels, they had a list of things they needed to work on, but they had to go live because that was their window of going live. So they knew, they went live. The employees, there's not an employee issue, it was more some of the behind the scenes things that had to be adjusted on adjustments that were done in first or second quarter. So they had their list. It created more work, I'm going to say, for the team, but at the end of the day, they made their date. So that's one of the things you have to kind of look at, what happens in that decision, the go, no go decision for going live.
Well, look, we're coming to the end of our time, so I'd love to throw it open to the floor for a Q&A. Please, any questions you have for Mary, if we can't answer it now, we'll answer it sort of in due course. But whilst those questions are coming in, people might allow me 60 seconds to talk about something about Payslip, which you may not actually realize. So people will know us as a technology vendor and a technology partner, assisting payroll teams in their digital transformation processes and helping them to harmonize, standardize the data, and automate a lot of those manual time consuming tasks. But you may not realize that we also provide a service to our customers, and we're very happy to provide this to our customers around managing that change and sourcing a new vendor. So we do it in two things, two ways. One, we offer trusted recommendations and introductions. So we have a network of in-country providers that go to the hundreds right around the world in every country you can think of. There are vendors who are using our platform and working with ours, and we have hard data on their performance. We know down to the finest detail how many GTN reversions, for example, they typically have, and the service benchmarks that you should be looking for. So, what does good actually look like right now? We have reliable feedback from payroll teams who are actually working with those ICPs, and we can facilitate an introduction to those trusted ICPs in any country. And then it comes to operations and data. So, because of the nature of how we orchestrate your operations, we're from a global to local data model where it's clean, validated, and standardized. It sort of solves a lot of those data migration challenges that Mary mentioned earlier on. You can trust in the data that you're actually handing over to an ICP. And we have a global first process model. So if you think about it, 10, 15, 20 entities, the processes, the workflows, they all look and feel the same. And I mean, when you've got somebody on who's familiar with those processes, well, it makes it much easier to transition because you've already got a framework in place. The vendor just has to slot into how you do things. And then, of course, it means easier migrations, fewer errors, faster stabilization, and you're working with already familiar with our technology and our processes, so the handover is much more seamless. Okay, with all of that said, I know we've got one question come in here from Lane McLaughlin. Mary Lane writes, often a significant challenge is resourcing the project internally.
Mhm.
SMEs need to be part of the project, but need to deliver on payroll. Any suggestions? Yeah. I
So
guess it
the
goes to the alignment question again, Mary.
Oh, that's a great question, and it happens with many or in many organizations. Having bringing in for your existing payroll processing to bring in some temps or contractors to come in and work during the project, and they work on the existing payroll while your team is working. The subject matter experts are working on the project, and you need them to be very honest. You need them as a leader. I know what the process is in the, 25, 30 countries that I'm working in, but I don't know the day to day. I don't know the pieces of the challenges that you have with the time and attendance in this file, or, what's required in that particular country for new hires, and are we going to meet those requirements, and who's responsible for some of those items. It's really the people in the day that do the day job, and they're key. And they're kind of key for two reasons. By having them work on the project and share the information, they start to be familiar with the vendor choice you have, what they're asking. They can share things that haven't and doesn't work today, right? Things that haven't been working for them today, especially on the integration side. And then those are things that can be brought forward. So that's a big one. And often I see companies recognizing that they need to bring additional temp resources in. But sometimes they say, well, we don't need them right now. So the mistake kind of happens is if you wait too long, then there's a problem that you haven't given enough time for the temps to come in to know what your existing processes is. So take advantage of bringing them in early. There's, I would say, in a payroll world, there's never something that we can't give some time to do. There's never extra time. So thinking about that and making that aware. And also there could be some support across your organization, that there may be somebody that you can pull in to help with some of the pieces. I always like to say that on the communication pieces, on different pieces, you can always use marketing communication to work on some of the things to bring out to employees, because they do that as their day job. So thinking across the organization, who could maybe help
Hmm.
on some of the project pieces.
I think that's a great tip. And as someone who works in communications, that's like, if you get to us early
Yeah.
enough, we're no, but Jenny, we're always happy to help out in other departments where the skill set might be there, or you just think, you need a little bit of extra help on the comms. I think it's a great point. I think some of the, additional intelligence that's in the business is so important. Okay, Justina has a very in-depth question, Mary. I'll try and sort of parse it as best I can, Justina. How would you deal with a situation you as a company signed a contract and the service is in the contract? However, the legislative requirement changed, and now the task requires additional people, and those people need to be certified. Okay. You can kind of see what she's driving at there. Yeah, it sort of makes sense to me, Mary. You'd have a better steer on this.
So this one, first of all, this is where I'm going to pull in my friends or stakeholders in legal and procurement, right? Because it's a legal requirement, and what's in the, we have to review the contract, and this isn't, it could be large or small depending on what's happening, because you're going to need to figure out, what we can or cannot do, right? And legal will be there, legal and procurement will be there with I would say, the documentation to support this, and having that conversation about what's happening, because this is something that is beyond what you knew at the time you signed the contract, right? I mean, that most of the vendors will tell you they're following the compliance for that particular location and countries that they're supporting. But when something comes up like this, it's a discussion that needs to be happening. And I would say it's sooner than later. And this is another one I would pull in your senior leadership in this one, so they're aware of it, because they may have to step in on a call and talk to somebody at the senior level for that vendor you're working with. So it's as soon as you know, make it well aware, but pull in. It's something well beyond what I would say, even as a global payroll leader, you're aware of it. You know the things that you have to address, but you need support on this. So pull in the troops on this one would be my 100% piece on that one. And that goes for anything large or small. Sometimes we in payroll don't want to ask, right? Don't be afraid to ask. It takes courage to say, I don't understand this. It takes courage to say, I need help and support. Those are things that we have. And those are all the things that are part of the profession that we're in. We're in a very, very important profession. We make a big difference in everyone's life every day. But it is sometimes we think that we should know everything. We don't. So it's okay to say, I don't know and I need help, right? And that's why we have the team in your organization and making sure people aren't surprised, like if you never mentioned it and then you drop a big bomb on your leadership or even on your manager not being aware. Those are the things that kind of cause a little issues. And why didn't you tell them? That's why having regular updates or reports that are coming out and dashboards and things that are going on, you let them know what's happening. But yeah,
I think
I'm
very,
gonna say good luck on
yeah,
that one.
yeah,
I mean, I'll be thinking about you to be
absolutely.
honest, because it's not it's a big challenge, but we can you can do it. That would be my message. And on
Yeah,
my last piece of the
absolutely. Yeah,
message, Gerald, I in the U.S. here we celebrate National Payroll Week, so it's a U.S. Week
absolutely.
to celebrate. And I know in some of the countries outside the U.S. They are celebrating too. But at the end of the day, payroll professionals, you actually make a huge difference in everyone's life. And, a big thank you from being a professional and working in the field, but it's one of the things that I think you should be honored and have some fun with your teams this week.
That's a lovely note to end on. Thank you so much to those of you still on the call who joined us, and thank you to those who are watching this back on replay. Really appreciate the engagement and the chat throughout. Get in touch, as I say, get in touch and stay in touch at payslip.com. Connect with me on LinkedIn, connect with Mary, and you know what? Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover because we've got some more slot for the end of the year. You better believe that Mary will be back with us again in 2026. So if you want us to go more in depth on something to do with change management, by all means, please get in touch or anything it is that crosses the very broad payroll spectrum. You let us know and we will organize a topic to sort of get the benefit of Mary's experience and again facilitate some of these conversations. It's if nothing else, it's really nice to get lots of payrollers together on the same chat in the same room and sort of share the knowledge and sometimes, as we see with Justina, share the frustrations as well. It's all part
Exactly.
and parcel of the industry. But with that said, I'll bid you adieu. Thank you so much for joining us, and indeed, I will see you on the next one. Take care, folks.
Thank you. Thank you.